Okay, so we're back for our Sunday morning Torah and Coffee, and today we are continuing the KABBALH series. And although we sort of diverted the KABBALH series into marriage, or the Kabbalistic approach to marriage, and we will try to get back eventually to a little bit more to the basics of KABBALH. And since we're talking about marriage, here's a picture of a Hasidic wedding, and I want to show how everybody is so joyous. And a little YouTube clip over here of a little bit of Hasidic dancing at a wedding in our Holy Land, in Israel. So here you go, you can see how everybody is joining the wedding and being so freilach, we say in Yiddish. And you're welcome to sing along. Okay, how are we doing over here? Okay, let's put this on pause and let us go to our class over here. Let's go over here, let's put this up, and let's begin to learn and study. First, as we always do when we begin the class, we make a bracha on our delicious coffee that God gave us. So please answer Amen. Baruch Ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehakol niyeh b'dvaroi. And today we will also talk about, my dear Facebook friends, we will also talk about the Basnach. We'll also talk about the tonight is the Yortzeit, which means commemorating the day of passing of the Rebbe's father, the Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, my saintly teacher and Rebbe, Hasidic master. And tonight is his father's Yortzeit, and he was a great Kabbalist. So maybe if we have time, we'll share a thought of his, which actually relates to marriage as well. So if we have time, we'll do so. So again, l'chaim. And let's begin. So last week, we spoke about marriage from its core perspective, or core underlying roots from a Kabbalistic perspective, which is that marriage is really the joining of one soul that was separated for a time being to each gain their own experiences, and then they come back together. And when you have that knowledge, underlying knowledge and understanding of your marriage with your spouse, it's a whole different approach and way of dealing with the challenges that come your way. So, and this week I want to discuss from also a Kabbalistic, because this class is Kabbalah, a Kabbalistic perspective that gives insight into how to then take the marriage into sort of its practical benefit, meaning the thought, the Kabbalistic thought, and how that gives us a insight in how to nurture and better develop our marriage, as I'll explain. I think I'm not being so clear, but give me some time and hopefully it'll all become clear. So, we all know that the standard accepted way of performing a marriage, sort of the technical mechanism of performing a marriage, is under the chuppah. And under the chuppah we say, Harei at mekudeshet li b'tabad zu kedat Moshe v'Yisrael. That with this ring, the groom says to the bride, you are consecrated to me according to the laws of Moshe and Israel. Now I want to give the history of this, and so you get a little bit knowledge of just the meat and potatoes of Yiddishkeit, of Judaism, and then the Kabbalistic insight into this and how it enhances our understanding of marriage and so on. So where does the ring come from? So by Jewish law, and as explained in the Talmud Tractate Kiddushin, on the first page, in fact, of Tractate Kiddushin, which means betrothing or betrothal, the mechanism of marriage is discussed. And the Talmud, the first Mishnah of marriage, goes on to say that there's three ways that a woman can be betrothed. And one of those ways is bekesef, is by handing something, literally kesef means silver or money, by handing money to your spouse. The man gives his wife something of value, and in turn, she commits herself to marriage, to marrying him. And this is what's called kiddushin. This is one of the three ways that constitutes the technical, legal, halachic transaction of marriage, or of at least betrothal. Okay, kiddushin. That's why under the chuppah we say, Harei at mikudeshet li. You are betrothed to me, you are sanctified to me. So, in the Talmud does not talk about a ring. The Talmud talks about something of value. Kesef. The tradition has become that it is a ring. Now, why the ring? Why the ring? And there are various answers given for the ring. So again, to explain very clearly, if you want to, under the chuppah, give your wife, your spouse, your bride at the time, if you want to give her Shabbos candles, a silver becher of Shabbat candles, and say, with this Shabbat candle, candelabria, or I don't know if I'm pronouncing the word right, with this leichter, we say in Yiddish, with this the candle, with this, I am betrothing you. So she becomes mikudeshet if she accepts. If you decide to give her a bouquet of flowers, if you decide to give her a Mercedes, if you decide whatever it is, you could halachically affect the kiddushin. However, the tradition has become the ring. Various reasons have been given for the ring. One reason is because when God married the Jewish people, or betrothed the Jewish people, which is Mount Sinai, it says in the Talmud that Kof Aleim Har Kigigis, God went ahead and he took the whole mountain, the Mount Sinai, and miraculously God held the mountain over the Jewish people, and that was like the ring that God held over the Jewish people in his beginning the process of marriage, the marriage between the God and the Jewish people. And as we said yesterday, every marriage is a manifestation or a reflection of the spiritual marriage, the godly marriage between God and the Jewish people. And there are many customs that we do at a wedding which reflect that, which are representative and are meant to remind us of that unity and relationship between God and the Jewish people. Another reason given for the ring is that a ring is a circle, and that circle represents that it's a closed circle, represents that in this relationship between the bride and the groom, nobody enters into that relationship. There's a unique bond and loyalty and unity and oneness and affection and intimacy and so on, which is between the bride and the groom, and nobody enters into that zone. That type of oneness is reserved only for the bride and the groom, husband and wife. And that's what the ring represents, amongst other things. But here I want to get into a Kabbalistic insight. And by giving us that Kabbalistic insight, we'll understand even more beautifully how this relates to a marriage and how this could enhance your marriage, etc. So, when God created the world, Kabbalah tells us that the first thing that God created, I don't know if created is the right word, but the first thing that God brought into being is an empty space. An empty space. Why an empty space? Because God's great infinite light, if that empty space would not have been created, there would not be space for anything else. Nothing else can exist because of the dominance of God's infinite light. So first God created an empty space, and that empty space in Kabbalah and Hasidus is called an igul. is called a circle, a sphere. And in that sphere is the empty space where God somewhat removed himself so that there could be space. And then it says, V'choza v'heir, he then went ahead and brought forth a small light that enabled creation to occur. And in fact, when that light was created, there was also vessels. Let me try to draw a picture. And I'm not an artist. I am the son-in-law of an artist, of a very famous artist, of Zalman Kleiman, whose yahrzeit, incidentally, with this past Shabbat. Maybe we'll mention something of him here. Let me see if I find a piece of paper over here. So, you ready for my deep art over here? So here's a circle. See, that's as far as I can go. I can't do much more than that, by the way. My kids know that when I play Pictionary, they get a good laugh, because by the time they see my pictures. Okay, so here's a circle, KABBALH, and dear friends. And then the circle is the space that God created. Then within that circle, there's Choza v'heir. God created a light to come in. What's with my pen? My pen is tzibrochen. But then there was vessels that God created. Vessels that can contain the light. So you have vessels. Let me see if I can draw this over here. One second, maybe on that thing. Nope, pen is gone. Talking about broken vessels. God created these little vessels, many vessels. You see these vessels? These are vessels. Do they look like a vessel? Just imagine that they're a vessel. Okay, vessels. Ain't today. Initially, the light, even this little light that God brought into the empty space here, the vessels all of a sudden all broke apart. It's too strong. It's too strong of a light. It blew the vessels. And that is called the world of tohu, the world of chaos, where there's too much energy and not enough light. It's almost like a genius who becomes unso. We all had friends like that, or people we knew that were geniuses, but they were awkward socially because they just didn't have the sort of proper vessels to handle that brilliance and so on. So you have that concept. And then you had the world of tikkun, the world of order that was created, which fixed it all up, so to speak. So what does that mean over here? So the ring, Kabbalah tells us, represents the following. In a marriage, there's several things that need to take place for a successful, healthy marriage. Number one, and I'll talk from the sort of husband's perspective, because I'm a man, what should I tell you? And in truth is a God and the Jewish people. God is usually the analogy of God is to the man, and the Jewish people to the woman. So in a marriage, you have the first thing, then, since it's the man that gives the ring, like a God who brings about the marriage between God and the Jewish people. So just like in God's creating of the world, when the marriage begins, we must first and foremost create a space. There has to be a space created. What does that mean? That you cannot enter into a marriage. There's the old saying, a marriage takes you from the first two letters in wedding is we. From I becomes we. There was a letter, I remember, that Rabbi Epstein from Carolina, Chabad rabbi in Carolina, was once here, and he gave a farbrengen and related the following. He said that someone once wrote to the Rebbe a letter with a bunch of issues and challenges he had in his life, and the Rebbe circled the first word of each paragraph and said, "This is the solution." This was the problem. This is the problem, and with dealing with this first letter in each of the paragraphs, you'll find the solution. And what was the beginning of each paragraph was I this, and I that, and so on. So the first thing in a marriage is that you have to, a child, I know I was listening to a class from Rabbi David Adnoy, I think is his name. I forgot, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, I'm not always good, and he gave a class on marriage. It's on YouTube, a great short class. And he relates that when his wife was expecting their first child, the doctor the doctor went ahead and was concerned and told the mother that she's low on calcium. So the mother said to the doctor, "Well, I'll make sure I'll take care of that so that my baby will be okay." So the doctor said to her, "Don't worry about your baby. Your baby is totally self-centered and will suck all the calcium out of your body. I'm more worried about you, that your bones should not become brittle and etc. The baby will be okay, because a baby by nature is all about itself, self-focused. The baby wakes up at 3 o'clock. There's the old saying that why babies can't talk, because if at 3 o'clock in the morning they woke up and they said, 'Give me food,' you'd say, 'Leave me alone, mach me nicht mashigen, geh schlafen.' But this way, babies don't communicate in a more intelligent way. They just say, 'I exist, you got to take care of me.' And as we get older, especially once we pass our teenage years, that's part of maturing. So marriage, first and foremost, the ring represents that you have to create a space. And that goes to both spouses, of course. You must create a space for each other. And the ring represents the space within you that you create. And when that space is created, that you realize this is not about me, and that's, I think, a big problem of why there are increased divorces, is because what we get from the popular culture often is that the marriage, the whole view of marriage is how it satisfies my needs, how it satisfies my desires, pleasures, whatever it might be. And that's the way marriage is portrayed. But the first thing of marriage is the ring, is in fact limiting yourself to create a space. And then, once that space is created, then you could start to have a light. And I want to add that not only that, we know in medicine and so on that when a vacuum is created, it draws in energy. So the space that is created over here is not just a space in terms of removing yourself, but it is also that removing of yourself should draw in, not only allow the other person to enter, but actually draw out the other person. Meaning that in a healthy marriage, not only should you not be full of yourself, but you should sort of give off the energy, the suction energy, that you allow the other person and you encourage the other person and you to bring out their best talents and their contributions to this relationship. That's part of what the space creates. It's space also in the negative, meaning you're creating a space, and in the positive, you're drawing forth energy, just like when God created the space, it drew forth this light that then filled the space, and it means both lights, your light and your spouse's light, have to fill it. It draws down the void draws down that energy. So you have to find ways to create the space and to create the encouragement. And that also happens in a way that you allow yourself, and this is another key ingredient, is that you allow yourself. Not only do you provide love, which is your energy, but you allow yourself to be loved. Allowing yourself to be the beneficiary in a healthy, humble way. This is all part of what we learn from the Kabbalistic analogy over here. And I want to add to that is that just like, and this is, I'm not sure I saw this anywhere, so you could take it or leave it, because when it's based on solid teachings, then it is what it is. We take it, we accept it. If we understand it or not, then we accept, because there are people that are far greater than us. But when it's our own saying, you could take it or leave it. But here, interestingly enough, when that initial energy comes down, the first stage, as I mentioned before, in the vessels, is that the vessels actually broke. And perhaps that's a lesson that it is very common that in the beginning of a relationship, the beginning of a marriage, there are broken vessels. Meaning, you try to bring an energy, but there will be challenges. There will be things that break, and later we have to fix it up. But it's okay. It's part of the process of creation. It's part of the process when something new happens. Kolat chalot kashot. Beginnings are difficult. That there should be breakings. There should be issues and so on. So this is just a little bit of a follow-up to the situation over here in terms of what we learn from the ring, what we learn from the drawing down, and how Hashem created the world. A little bit more of a Kabbalistic insight into the aspect of marriage. I want to move on from here and talk about the Rebbe's father. The Rebbe's father was, as I mentioned, a great Kabbalist. He was a Rebbe. He was the rabbi of Dnieper-Petrovsk. At that time, it was known as Yekaterinoslav, and he was which was basically the center of Judaism in that whole region of the Ukraine. And the Rebbe's father, the Rebbe Nachman Noshnesin, grew up in a home where during World War I it was the hub of many Jewish refugees, and they all came to the rabbi, which was Reb Leivik. That was his name, Reb Lev Yitzchak. He was called Reb Leivik, and that's where many Jews found refuge. The Rebbe himself, and I heard this from the Rebbe at a Fabrengen, related how his mom and his home became a place where refugees from all over Russia and Ukraine, the USSR, found their way to the Rebbe's home, and they were there to make sure they had food and places to stay and so on. They were true refugees in the fullest sense. And I remember also hearing a story from the Rebbe. I heard this personally at a public gathering where the Rebbe related about his father. His father, just to step back for a moment, his father passed away. The yahrzeit is tonight, and he passed away in exile in a city called Kostroma in Russia. He was exiled because he was, as I mentioned, he was the rabbi in a very powerful position in terms of Jewish leadership in the Ukraine, he defied, especially later when the communists took over, he defied the communist government by publicly going ahead and proudly teaching Judaism and so on, which they were totally against, as we know, part of the Russian Jewish history. And this following story highlights that. And eventually they arrested him and they sent him to prison and then to exile, and he died in exile. So I remember the following story where the Rebbe mentioned, the Rebbe told the story actually to a children's gathering about his dad, which highlights the father's proud and strong commitment to Jewish tradition, etc. And he said like this: the Ukraine and that region was the place that provide. Apparently, it was a main region for wheat that provide grain and so on for the entire Russia. And as such, the Jews also would get their matzah for Passover from that area, which was, communist. All the businesses were basically owned by the communist government, including the matzah business, which was a big business, providing matzah for millions of Russian Jews. And the one who gave the hashgacha, the kosher symbol, the kosher certification for the matzah, was Reb Leivik, because the Russian government knew that Jews wanted matzah that was truly kosher for Passover, not matzah that just the Russian government gave their stamp on. So every single year, Reb Leivik would be the one who gave the kosher stamp he would provide the supervision for the matzah. So one year, and this was during a time where basically most of the rabbis either fled Russia or retired from their position because it became impossible to really be a rabbi and have the integrity of a rabbi and stand up to the Russian government. Or many of the rabbis became what was called a Rav Mitam, a Russian rabbi that was basically just a stamp of approval of the Russian government. In other words, they just did whatever the government told them. So the Russian officials were accustomed that when they came to any of the rabbis, basically they got whatever they wanted. So they came to Reb Leivik and they told Reb Leivik, the Rebbe's father, that, and I guess, again, I guess it was, a lot of it was cost, because to properly have proper supervision, there was a cost involved, and there was a headache involved. And they told the Rebbe's father they expect him to continue to give his stamp of approval, but they'll handle it. And the Rebbe's father said to them, I'm not intimidated by you. I will not give my approval unless I have full authority of every step of the matzah process and baking and so on. And they knew that when Reb Leivik was a very stubborn and determined man. They said they knew they can't play games with him, and they also knew that they needed him, because if his stamp of approval did not appear on the matzah, Jews throughout Russia would not eat the matzah. And so this was a story I remember hearing from the Rebbe highlighting who this great man was. And again, tonight is his yahrzeit. And he also has an insight into the spiritual marriage of God and the Jewish people relating to Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot. But maybe we'll share it as we get closer to the high holidays, because I also want to just quickly share one more yahrzeit, which was my father-in-law. My father-in-law's yahrzeit was yesterday. And some of you might know who my father-in-law is or was, Rabbi Zalman Kleiman, a very known Hasidic artist. Many of his pictures sell for $80,000, $90,000, but this is, I don't own any of them. I do own one original picture, which is a picture of my wife in the bungalow colonies in the Catskills. Give us a thumbs up for the Catskills. Who doesn't love the Catskills? Perhaps the best place on earth. Not necessarily the greatest of the mountains, but the Catskills has its beautiful, unique flavor. So my father-in-law's yahrzeit was this past Shabbat, yesterday. So in memory of his soul, I want to relate the following story that I heard from a dear friend. My father-in-law was an artist, and he was a very bright man. He was a very learned, and he loved learning all kinds of studying. Of course, he studied the entire Talmud, but he just loved learning all kinds of knowledge. But he was a man with very, very high integrity, very high integrity. And there's many stories that highlight and that talk to his integrity. And one story that I found very telling of his personality and character, I heard from a friend of his by the name of Reb Heshka Dubrovsky, of blessed memory. Reb Heshka Dubrovsky told me, he related this to me. I once asked him, he was a good friend of my father-in-law. This was after my father-in-law passed away. Reb Heshka Dubrovsky himself, as we say, he has since passed away as well. A generation of very fine people. So he said to me like this, that when my father-in-law just came to the United States, and at the time he was a struggling artist, he really struggled. A lot of these pictures became what they became later in his lifetime, and then, as we know, after an artist passes away, the pictures, the price skyrockets. But this was in the early days, and he definitely struggled. And Reb Heshka Dubrovsky worked for, some of you who know the earlier printings here in the United States, worked for a company called the Schulzinger, I think it was, either Schlesinger or Schulzinger family, who owned a Jewish printing house, and they printed books. So Reb Heshka asked the owners of the Schulzinger printing house whether they would consider asking my father-in-law to make some sort of monogram for the opening of one of the books that they were printing. And it was, I guess, common then, or certain books, that they would have a monogram, a little artist monogram in the beginning of the book. So they said, fine, if we could help an up-and-coming or a struggling sort of artist, we'll do so. So Reb Heshka Dubrovsky mentioned this to my father-in-law, and he asked my father-in-law, and he discussed it with him, and he told him, so my father-in-law gave him a price. I think the price at the time was $300 or something like that. I don't know what the price was. It was some sort of price. Reb Heishka went back to the Schlesingers and mentioned to them that this was my father-in-law's price. So this is the story that I heard from Reb Heishka. Reb Heishka said that the actual owner said to Reb Heishka, I cannot pay him that amount. I have to pay him more because it's just not prestigious for me to put it in the book and word gets out or that I only paid whatever amount is. I'll pick $100. I have to pay him at least $300. At the time, $300 was money. This goes back probably in the 50s. So my Reb Heishka says he came back. He was the middleman. He came back to my father-in-law, and he said they insist on paying you more. And my father-in-law responded. My father-in-law said that I'm not taking a penny more than my price because that's what I value my work, and I will not take even 1 penny more. And that is telling of who my father-in-law was. This is not just a nice story. That's who he was, a man of tremendous integrity. And it's not always, we're talking about marriage. I hope I can get away with this. It's not always easy to marry the daughter of a person like that, because my wife also is extremely principled in a good way. She's very, very principled. So that describes who he was. That's who he was. I'll say, since we have a little bit of time, I'll say one more story to that effect. There was a lady, my father-in-law, he was a survivor of the war as a child. He grew up he was in an orphanage. It's a very beautiful story in its own right of how very good people helped save him. And then he came to Israel, and as a teenager, again, he was an artist. He would do art. He went into the Israeli army. And as soon as they saw his talent, they enlisted him to do art for the Israeli army. Again, this was in the 50s, probably the early 50s. And he would do murals for the Israeli army. And he would he would work very hard to pay for his own bills and pay for whatever it is to make a living. Not to make a living, really, to make much of a living, but just to put food in his mouth. And there was a woman, a very righteous woman. Her name was Gittel Friedman. She was the mother of one of my late teachers, Rabbi Yisrael Friedman. And she had a little restaurant in Kfar Chabad. People knew about the restaurant. And my father-in-law, as a young teenager, would come there. He would go ahead and he would eat. He would buy food over there. And she knew his background, and she knew that he's struggling. So one day, she knew where he stayed or slept or whatever it is, and she slipped the money that he paid for the food back into his package, back into his luggage or backpack. And my father-in-law noticed, I guess he realized the money was there, and he said to her like this. He came back to her and he said to her like this. He says, look, we have an agreement, we have an arrangement. He says, if you do that again, I'm going to have to find another place to get my food from. Please do not do that. I am paying for my food. So that here you have two stories that describes who my father-in-law was. He passed, his yahrzeit was yesterday. He's a great artist. He's a great artist. In case you want any of his art, it's not an advertisement. I'm just saying in terms of art that gives forth the flavor of Jewish life in the Hasidic world. Many of the pictures you'll sometimes see on the internet, you'll see is from Zalman Kleiman, Hasidic pictures. So that's that for today. A little discussion about continuing about marriage from a Kabbalistic perspective. A little bit about the Rebbe's father, whose yahrzeit is tonight. About my father-in-law. I'm glad that you joined us, and you should have a fantastic week, an uplifting week, a meaningful week. A lot of shalom bayit, a lot of peace in your home. The Talmud tells us, Leimotza Kodesh Baruch Hu Kli Machzik Broch Ela HaShalom. God did not find a better vessel or any vessel for blessing more than peace. And the most important place for peace to begin is in your home. And it's the most important and healthy foundation for your kids to grow up in. So that's that. And Mirz Hashem, we will continue. Everybody have a fantastic, amazing week and share these words of Torah with others.